الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome everybody to the Safina Society Nothing But Facts live stream on a Thursday, a beautiful sunny Thursday, on a day after we had a winter drive in which we gave away how many hats, Omar? Over near to 100 winter hats. What else did we give away?
Give away supplies for
winter supplies,
just basic necessities,
basic winter related necessities, and you figuring that maybe people by now they need to replenish their winter necessities for the last 2 months of winter coming upon us. And so that's where we constantly need your support at La Cocina 367. Now, I have to tell you something. We do have a philosophy. We fundraise to build up assets, okay? We fundraise to build up assets, and that is what we're doing right now. The assets then cover our costs and the food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we do need is a boost so that we could continue building assets that will produce the revenues. So just so you know, it's not always donations to be used right away. No, we try to use the donation to build an asset. Okay, you understand how it works? And the asset then produces the revenue. Today we have a wonderful guest. Shaykh Hasan Spiker is on. Today was also his last day on Twitter, if you saw his announcement. And also, I've turned very sour on the platform too because of Elon Musk's constant, nonstop, at this point getting sort of pathetic, kissing the ring of every possible Zionist out there and the worst of the worst. He supports the worst of the worst. I really don't even know why I log on anymore, right? I really don't even know. It's a great way to get certain messages out there, announcements. Maybe I think they'll just start using it for announcements. That's it. And instead, it'll just try to build up this new platform. It's going to be a woke platform. We know that because it's run by, what's his face? Jack Dorsey. But for now, it's called Blue Sky. First, I thought it was some Polish thing, Blueski, but it's Blue Sky. So I'll give it a shot. We'll see what happens. I started already, and you could see, or you could join there, and it's got like 10 people on it. So there's only 4 million people on the whole thing. But maybe it's going to be less toxic, less acidic, less jidal. I just can't. At some point, your heart doesn't accept it anymore. The heart of a dhakir cannot do jidal more than like 2 replies. Khalas. So khalas. So too much jidal, too much nonsense and weirdos and no-name people. So we're going to give that, excuse me, going to give that a shot. And for now, let's turn to our interview today with Shaykh Hasan Spiker. All right, Omar, bring him on. Welcome from Amman, Jordan. Jazakallah khair for coming on.
Hayyakum Allah. Lovely to see you.
So it's great to have you on after reading a lot of your posts, pro-Palestine posts, and also sometimes ask you to defend some of the Ash'ari points of Aqidah on Twitter, and where there's a lot of debate on these masail. But the main thing that I think that you brought to the table is a discussion on some of the ideas of Ibn Arabi. And why don't we start there? Why don't you tell our audience, share with our audience, what exactly is the main contribution of Ibn Arabi? What's his place in Islamic theology, and how you feel that this is beneficial?
Well, I think Shaykh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi is an absolutely unique figure. He's obviously immensely attractive and in a strange way accessible to the modern deep thinking Muslim, non-Muslim, even modernists, even Islamic modernists seem to love him. He is beloved of all stripes, all different types of people. He has a kind of extraordinary universal appeal. And I think in that sense, one of the most extraordinary things about him is that he is not really, he's in no way a dogmatic thinker. So it's not about being part of this school or the other school. I think he of all people would be horrified if people even dogmatically blindly followed him. But what is extraordinary about his thought, and it's not really the right word, but his thought, it certainly does have a thought dimension, a discursive dimension, is that he is someone who brings to bear all of the human faculties when he looks at reality. So he's not a rationalist. He's not just determined to use logic chopping and what we think of as reason, kind of reasoning in a straight line, and that's it. That's the only means to knowledge. He's not an empiricist. It's not just the senses. He's not a fideist. It's not just scripture. And he's not an esoterist either, though many people think he is. He's not saying that the only source of knowledge is mystical knowledge. He is, in a way, paradigmatic as this synthetical thinker who brings together, it's what one might call faculty holism, that we are endowed by Allah Ta'ala with all of these different faculties. We have the reasoning mind, we have the spirit, which has spiritual experience, we have the senses, and of course we have access to receiving revelation. Of course, I mean the means of receiving revelation is in terms of historically is obviously al-khabar as-sadiq and tawatur and so on. So we have all of these different means of these sources of knowledge, and the extraordinary thing about him is that he brings them all together in a synthesis. He took the time, despite his extraordinary spiritual capacity, to study hundreds of books with tens of great teachers of his time. And he's really a very, very accomplished alim. And it's even said of him that he was the most knowledgeable person in his time in every fan, which is really probably an exaggeration, but it goes to show just how shamil his knowledge is and how how wide his knowledge is. And he is for Sufis, I think, a kind of ultimate burhan of their way. He is someone who non-Muslims, as I was saying at the beginning, and people who don't particularly come from a traditional, and certainly not a traditionalist background, as much as I don't like the term, see in him this kind of burhan, this kind of proof of the truth of Islam. That he can speak to someone immersed in modern philosophy, and somehow there's this transformative transmission by turns, intellectual, spiritual, which convinces people that, gosh, suddenly everything makes sense. Another thing that people say about him is that he has an answer to every conceivable philosophical question, which is not really the case with, Michel Chodkiewicz, Sheikh Ali Chodkiewicz, who was an Ibn Arabi specialist who died a few years ago, quite a prominent specialist. He didn't consider even that someone of the stature of Imam al-Ghazali, I'm not saying I agree with him, but had that particular quality of really any question you have, you'll find it in al-Shaykh al-Akbar, and that includes modern questions. To give an example, gender fluidism and ideology, trying to work out how to answer that from a metaphysical perspective and make sense of that. Ibn Arabi has a ready answer. It's absolutely no problem. So
what is that answer?
Well, the answer broadly is that gender is a metaphysical principle. It's something which runs throughout all of creation. And broadly, the masculine principle is the principle of activity, and the feminine principle is the principle of receptivity and affectivity. And so what we find and that starts with the qalam and the lawah, and and so the qalam is the active principle which possesses all of the universals, and as it were, inscribes them and even plants them, one might say, in the tablet. And the tablet then as this kind of fertile domain in which all the particulars of those universals arise. So he has an extraordinary. You can't play with gender because it's simply a principle of existence. It's not something that is in any way discernible as a choice.
SubhanAllah.
So it's that kind of thing.
So when you talk about mystical knowledge, a lot of people have trouble with mystical knowledge because when we speak, speech and reason are intertwined.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit on how what exactly is mystical knowledge? If it's something that seems to be different from rational and empirical knowledge.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, absolutely. People raise an objection, which I think is based really quite straightforwardly on a misunderstanding, that mystical knowledge, according to the prescription of the advocates of mystical knowledge, is a tawr wara al-aql. It's a stage or domain, it's a level, it's a world beyond the aql. And therefore, how can that be used as a premise in rational thinking? How can that be in any way knowledge which, well, it might be interesting to read about people's claims of their experiences, but how can it form part of our overall picture of reality, which is supposed to be accessible to everyone, for example? Well, I think this is based on a basic misunderstanding of what being a tawr beyond the aql means. For one thing, there's a distinction between the discursive aql, which is the aql which essentially reasons in a straight line. 1 + 1 = 2. Every A is B, every B is C, so every A is C. That kind of logical, discursive, linear reasoning. And there's al-aql min haythu huwa qabil, which you might call the receptive intellect. And that's the aql which simply discerns distinct objects, right? So whether those are intelligible objects, as in pure concepts, let's say universals. They've got this universal and you've got this universal. You've got the universal of human being and the universal of just purely abstract concepts like unity and multiplicity and things like that. And because you can distinguish between them, they are distinct in themselves. You can intend as an intentional object that one or that one. The same with sensible objects. You distinguish between them. And the thing is, mystical experience is exactly the same, because the mystical experience is distinct. So the point I'm trying to make is, yes, mystical experience is a tawr, is a stage or domain or world beyond the discursive aql, right? The aql which reasons in a straight line in that fashion. But so is the sensible world. Just as much. The sensible world is also a tawr beyond that discursive aql, right? So the point is, people have these misconceptions about reasoning, which are maybe insufficiently philosophical, as if reason is somehow this self-explanatory thing. Well, in fact, reasoning is just a form, right? It's a form which requires matter. So in logic, you have this distinction between logical form and logical matter. So logical form is just, say the figures of the syllogism, the fact that you have to have, you have to have a first premise, you have to have a second premise, you have to have a conclusion, and then how do you get from the premise to the conclusion, where it's by the middle term, and then what position is the middle term in the first premise? If it's in, let's say, the predicate position, then it's the first figure. If it's the predicate position of the first figure in the first premise, and etc. So. And if it's the subject position and the second premise, then it's called the first figure. That's the form. Now, that in itself is completely empty. That's the logical form. That's not ever going to get you anywhere, except seeing that that logical form has to produce a true conclusion. But you don't, but at this stage, because we're only at the stage of logical form, we don't even know what we're reasoning about. You have to be reasoning about something. Right. So the idea that you can include mystical knowledge Well, if you can include sensible knowledge, if you can reason about sensible objects, right, which are again are told beyond discursive reason, you can also reason about mystical objects.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people might say, well, that's just a very, very small group of people who've had those experiences. Well, look, that may well be true today.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, it was very, very ordinary for people to go to a maqam of a great wali and experience an effusion of barakah, an actual presence, something very, very tangible, sometimes even receiving knowledge from that encounter. And, that's why someone like Fahd al-Razi in his Matalib al-Aliyah, even though people don't think of him at all as a mystical writer, actually, he's very mystical later on in his career in al-Tafsir al-Kabir and also al-Matalib al-Aliyah. He actually writes about the metaphysics of visiting a maqam and how do you derive a fayd from that presence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's reasoning about mystical experience, presupposing that a lot of the people that he's talking to know what he's talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the point is, if there's a shared mystical experience, you can reason about it.
Mm-hmm.
It can take it. You have to then explain that phenomenon in the larger context of the entire, of being, of the universe, of experience, in terms of reason. Right?
Now, is it accurate to say that mystical experience is essentially is very similar to sensory perception, but it is of the soul to the ghaib,
Exactly.
and hence, because it's ghaib, it essentially falls in the category of transmitted testimony, and it is treated as such. So, for example, a random person says, I saw such and such a vision.
Mhm.
We don't know you. I'm going to put it in an unknown category. A reliable, trusted person tells you the same thing. I choose to believe it, and nobody can say he's a liar because we can't prove that he's a liar. We have no contrary piece of evidence. So I say that he's truthful. And then a liar, a known person who exaggerates, then comes and tells us that they saw that such and such a vision. We say, no, your background is that you're a liar. So we, no matter how beautiful your vision, no matter how much corroboration it has, we put an X on it. So it's treated very much like any other transmitted evidence. So you deem that to be accurate?
That's absolutely accurate, and that's a different dimension of a way to treat of mystical experience. The angle that I was talking about just now is where, for example, you read in, let's say, Al-Futuhat or somewhere else, one of the books of the Awliya, about an experience of the presence of the Haqiqah Muhammadiyah, for example. Now, if you yourself have had that experience of the Haqiqah Muhammadiyah, then you'll immediately understand what he's talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then anything that he says about the rational, the logical status of the Haqiqah Muhammadiyah, because there are things that you can say, let's say it's the universal pattern of all of the subsequent particulars which are subordinate to it.
Mm-hmm.
That all has rational content.
Yes.
If you experience the Haqiqah Muhammadiyah, then you will know what he's talking about. So in that sense, it's analogous to sense experience, right? I recognize when someone's talking about sense experience, they're talking about the sky and trees and mountains in the world, not because I'm having that experience right now, but because I recognize that experience. If someone reasons about what's going on in Australia and you've never been there, right, that's a little bit different. That becomes more of a transmitted report.
Mm-hmm. And it's so it's very similar to then the sighted and the blind, for example. Now, okay, if that's the case, then would it necessitate, or actually, let me put it this way, elaborate for us on where would we place mystical knowledge in epistemology? Will it be downgraded because it's something we all don't have access to it and to checking it?
Well, there's a distinction, obviously, between metaphysics and epistemology, which is really an I'tibari distinction, but it doesn't make it not real. So it's perspectival, but you can have perspectival properties which are real, because it's about your means of approach to reality, right? So saying which one has priority, metaphysically, mystical knowledge has ascendancy over sense knowledge and merely rational knowledge. But epistemologically, we're talking about priority in terms of sequence. How do you get to the conclusion that you're going for? Now, mystical knowledge is of absolutely no use if it's not regulated by the other aspects of human experience, because we're not just spiritual beings, we're not esoterists. It's not the only mystical knowledge. Now, that's a mistake that a lot of modern people who are very interested in spirituality tend to make. They might be total modernists about philosophy. They might be even really methodological skeptics. They might not even believe you can prove the existence of God using reason, but they're esoterists, as in, I can get on with just making money and being in this world and being, totally worldly, because none of that really matters. The secret access that I have is to this mystical knowledge, which that's the only true knowledge, right? I don't mean totally worldly, obviously, in the sense of, being a hedonist, because if they're spiritual, they're unlikely to be like that. But I mean in the sense that, there's no integration between my metaphysical view and my reason, right? It's just pure esotericism. Other than that, I'm just, it's just the world. It's just, it's just the, the world which is somehow opposed fundamentally to the spiritual. And so the point is, I'll give you an example. The Sayyid Sharif al-Jurjani says in Sharh al-Mawaqif, mystical experience cannot be used to prove the creed on a public level. Something very interesting. It's because the Jews and the Christians, and I think he particularly confines it to the Jews and Christians, maybe he says other religions as well, but they also have spiritual experiences by which they claim somehow prove the truth of their creed.
Correct.
That's why he says mystical knowledge has to be supplemented by a rational framework, by rational arguments.
Correct.
Right? Because we believe in reason, we believe in rationality. So the point is, yes, no, I mean, in terms of the first stages of knowledge of the world, it's not that we, before teaching someone how to read and write and how to reason and basic stuff and how to use their senses, we just put them into a khalwa and that's how they get to know everything. Quite to the contrary, the rational framework, proofs for the existence of of God, Allah Ta'ala, of prophethood, of the basic items of creed, that has to come first, and that absolutely has to serve there as a foundation. And Ibn Arabi says as much very, very, very clearly. He says that reason can prove the existence of God. It can prove the possibility and actuality of the Risala. And, absolutely, it's a total prerequisite and necessity for someone who wants to then enter the world of direct knowledge, of spiritual experience, to have that foundation there. Otherwise, they can go very, very badly astray, of course, and not be able to discern between different experiences.
It's great. It's critical that you mentioned this, that mystical knowledge needs to be couched with some rails, because I'll give you two examples. And you already mentioned it about many of Christian and Jewish apologists using mystical knowledge as their proof in the public. So there was a bishop recently who said a couple things about Islam. When asked about Christianity, he said, Jesus is the truth because I know him, I experienced him. Yeah. So he went on for about 5 minutes talking about how he experienced Jesus, which is merely your own testimony and is not a proof for anybody. Also, another person who did this essentially really was Frithjof Schwann. If you think about the perennialist claim that religions are relative, relativity is in need of an absolute to tell you that it's relative. So who's the absolute? The perennialist leaders have essentially, without saying so, rendered themselves the judges of these religions.
Yeah.
So the chain of transmission, the chain of authority of this truth really just goes back to the first person to say these things are all relative, and then nobody asks questions about that. So it's so important for people to recognize this, that personal experiences, spiritual experiences have to be couched. That's why we have an orthodoxy, and that's the only way to have a community, where an ummah, where the truth claims are verifiable for everybody. Right?
Yep.
And it is not so far off from the concept of moon sighting versus calculation. So no Muslim has ever negated the possibility for us to know, that for scientists to know and astronomers to know when a new moon is coming out. But we can't use this for a public mass religion where only 0.001% of people know how it works. It needs to be something democratic, right? Everybody with two eyes can go look at it. Now, you mentioned that Ibn Arabi does hold that people should have this reason-based and transmission-based foundation in theology. Let me now ask a follow-up question. Did he endorse for people to follow any specific works of theology or schools of thought?
Well, he sets out in his major work, the Futuhat, he commences the Futuhat with an aqidah. He says, this is my aqidah. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Of course, people don't listen to him and they tell him otherwise, but that's what he says. This is my aqidah, so take it or leave it. That's what I'm telling you. And that aqidah is an aqidah which is just about as compatible with the aqaid of Ahl Sunnah al Jama'ah as you can possibly get, in the sense that it's not very overtly Ash'ari or Maturidi. It's compatible with the Ash'ari aqidah. It's compatible with the Maturidi aqidah, and it's compatible with what you'd find in Al-Tahawiyah, for example. And obviously, what distinguishes one from another are certain particular points. And I'm not saying that he endorses all of them, but it's broadly acceptable to all of them. It's really as he tries to found it as clearly as possible in the same proof text that they are drawing upon. It's an aqidah definitely that falls within acceptability, what I'm trying to say, for those approaches. But I'm not going to say he's an Ash'ari. Some people would like to. He agrees with Sha'ira on many issues, but he disagrees with them on many issues. He's very clear about that. It's not really in any way ambiguous. I mean, he's very, very clear about praising the Sha'ira on some issues and saying that they're mistaken on others. One of them is the super addedness of the attributes, for example. He doesn't really think that is justified in any way. And he says, min ayna lahum, what real evidence do they have? It's just a semantic proof that they have. It's not a real proof.
Could you explain what that meant, super added?
Well, just the idea that the divine attributes are not identical to the divine essence. Now, they're obviously not identical in the sense that we can pick them out and talk about, the qudra, the irada, and so on, as we're saying qudra and irada, we're not saying essence. So they must be distinct to that, conceptually, to that extent. But it's more than that. It's the idea that they are distinct beyond the merely conceptual level.
So to take it a step back to explain the Ash'ari position here, that the attributes are neither the essence nor separate from the essence, is what the Ash'ari said. Yeah. And to say that they're the essence would be refuted by the fact that we talk about them separately. So we can't say they're the essence. You can't say they're separate from the essence, because that negates the unicity of the divine. that he is ahad, one in himself, not consistent of parts. So this is why that Shada ended up saying the attributes and the essence is not the essence, nor distinct from the essence. So how did Ibn Arabi reply?
Well, I think he feels that this is a doctrine which is rather devoid of content. He finds it very far-fetched, the formulation that they are neither identical nor distinct, disparate. And he says that very explicitly, that it's a far-fetched formulation. And I think that he feels that it does actually, insofar as it's, well, look, there's two things. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but, a way that this is often critiqued by those who are within Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah but don't hold to that view is that essentially, if you're saying that the divine attributes are not identical in the sense that they are distinct in their mafhum, right, and you're saying that they are not ghayr, right, in the sense that they can't be separated from the divine essence, what is their ontological status? It seems to be that what you're saying is ontologically they are identical to the essence. They're just different in mafhum. Now, there's no school of thought who doesn't think that they're different in mafhum.
Mafhum being what is understood.
Yeah, what is understood, because obviously everyone is picking. I mean, we wouldn't be able to discuss the masala if we weren't able to distinguish these different. So I think that line of critique says, well, either this is actually fairly devoid of content, and it's actually what's called a khilaf lafzi. You're right, it's merely a verbal difference, which people, often ulama actually differ. Is this a ma'nawi difference? Is it actually a real difference, or is it just a lafzi difference? It's just a verbal difference. Either it's just a verbal difference, in which case, Shaykh al-Akbar would say it's actually not the best adab, actually, because of the way that it's muhim. It may lead people to think there's some sort of dependency within the divine essence. There's some sort of ihtiyaj within the divine essence, or there's some sort of multiplicity within the divine essence. Or it's not, it's actually a khilaf ma'nawi, in which case you must be saying there's an actual ontological superaddedness of the attribute. Now that becomes very problematic, because what precisely could you mean by an ontological superaddedness of the attributes when you're talking about, of course, the Ash'ari and everyone else? I'm not saying that they don't, but the Ash'ari and everyone else from Ahl Sunnah al Jama'ah say that Allah Ta'ala is basit. He's not composite, right? He's not a composite of parts. He's not made up of parts. Of course, hashahum. I'm not saying that Ash'ari hasha na, actually, but I'm not saying that the Ash'ari are saying that Allah Ta'ala is a composite of parts, but it becomes very difficult to discern what one could possibly mean if one was saying that the attributes are super added ontologically, other than there being parts.
In this case, this mas'ala itself is far'i, meaning branches off from the true difference, which is what is the definition of an attribute?
Yeah.
Is it merely a different way of speaking about the divine, or is it something else altogether? And that's the real point of difference, right? Good. So now let's take a shift now from this theological, philosophical discussion to something I would say is more of a just a description of Ibn Arabi and some of his mysticism. Could you kindly talk about some of his mukashafat that you've read over the years that you found transformative to people? Because when I think we talk about mystical experience and reason, there's a philosophical element, but there's also should be an actual mystical element of our discussion, which is just to talk about some of his mukashafat and how they touch people.
Well, I have to say that the mukashafat which are most meaningful for me are the ones which reveal an order of reality which can make sense of everything. Now, it's all very well having extraordinary experiences, and I think they are interesting in and of themselves, but they can often have the quality of subjectivity. As well, an extraordinary experience, mashallah, but ba'dain. I'd like to have an experience like that. But I think the extraordinary thing about Ibn Arabi is his mystical experiences these weren't subjective experiences for him. These were unveiling the structure of reality, right? So, and this is why, you have this complementarity, this continuity between the mystical and the rational orders. It's not just the issue of have you had the same experience? Have you experienced the spiritual presence of the Prophet ﷺ, for example, in which case you recognize what he's talking about. It's more than that. It's about saying, when I read about his mystical experiences with a certain level, not like him, obviously, but with a certain level of one's own personal corroboration, I don't just have a warm feeling about barakah and a mystical experience, but I actually see this kind of internal logic about the maratib of wujud, about the hierarchy of reality. So that's why, when he talks about alam al-Mithaal, for example, he has had all sorts of extraordinary experiences, which are detailed in his works, of course. One can also read about them quite extensively in excellent works like the English language biography of Shaykh al-Akbar, which is written, what's it called? Quest for the Red Sulphur, for example. That has a lot of, it's quite a reliable book, not in every way. There's things I find a little bit muhim about perennialism. I don't think the author is a perennialist, but there are things that one has to be slightly careful about there. But I think generally it's very, very mu'tamad and very, very helpful book, very, very carefully researched. And
Can you explain alam al-Mithaal to everybody?
Well, alam al-Mithaal is the world that this world is directly subordinate to, right? And so, as a bit of a muqaddimah, let me just tell you a little bit about the overall account of the levels of existence in Shaykh al-Akbar. So, Allah Ta'ala is the absolute, the one, al-Khair al-Mahd. He is in himself, right? Not, I know it gets a bit complicated, so forgive me, but in himself, insofar as we have to conceive of Allah Ta'ala without respect to creation. Now, creation is a fact, it's happened, but if we think of Allah Ta'ala just in himself, in the sense that the only one who knows Allah Ta'ala fully is Allah Ta'ala. Right? The only one who knows the absolute fully is that is in the Akbarian understanding called al-Ahadiyya, which can also be, there has lots of names. There's also martabat al-la ta'ayyun, for example, the degree of non-determination, right? Now, a lot of critics, unfortunately, of Akbarianism say, well, what do you mean that God in himself is indeterminate and somehow arbitrary, or he's not muta'ayyan, he's not individuated, and he's not, there's no Akbarian who doesn't think that Allah Ta'ala is muta'ayyan, by the way. This is talking about something entirely different. When we say martabat al-la ta'ayyun, we're saying he is not restricted in himself by any description we could give of him, by any limitation that we could impose upon him. He transcends any of those things in himself. So he's mutlaq, they say, right? That's also the degree of al-wujud al-mutlaq. He's mutlaq hatta an qayd al-itlaq. Even that term, that qualification, the word we're using, when we're calling him mutlaq, he's mutlaq even beyond that, beyond that itlaq. So that's martabat al-la ta'ayyun, right? So, that degree of transcendence and pure unknowability. Now, it's quite amusing when people make this pantheist accusation against, well, it's not really that funny, but it's rather unfortunate when this pantheist accusation is made against Shaykh al-Akbar, when I've never read an account of the tanzih, the transcendence of Allah Ta'ala, which is more clear and emphatic than in that that school of thought. God in himself is transcendent beyond any of our attempts to grasp him. He's mutlaq hatta an qayd al-itlaq. So the question arises, how does al-dhuhur take place? How do we go from this pure unknowability to the emergence of creation of this distinct world, right? The next stage after al-ahadiyya is al-wahda. Al-wahda is the dimension, is the level of al-haqiqah Muhammadiyah as well. Al-haqiqah Muhammadiyah, so this is the spiritual reality of the Prophet ﷺ as an object of knowledge of God. Again, people get unfortunately confused if they don't have a teacher, where they start thinking, well, there's the ahadiyya and the wahda and the wahadiyya, and that's three, and oh dear, I'm starting to get worried. No, the ahadiyya is God in himself. Everything else is an object of God's knowledge, right? It's simply an object of God's knowledge. Allah, according to all of the schools of Sunni thought, is omniscient, right? That's one of his kamalat. It's actually kufr to deny it. So he knows everything distinctly in eternality, right? In his eternity, knows everything distinctly, right?
Is this ahadiyya and wahda is in the Salah al-Mashishiyah?
Where it says وَغْرِقْنِي فِي عَيْنِ الْبَحْرِ الْوَحْدَةِ.
Yes,
Absolutely. وَفِي بِحَارِ الْأَحَدِيَّةِ. Exactly. You're
so
quite right.
let's go over those terms again. What are the ahadiyya referring to? Al-Wujud, the Wujud of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his absoluteness and transcendence.
Yeah.
And the wahda being?
The wahda is the first determination, right? So, you have the famous hadith, which is not a real hadith according to the muhaddithun, but is actually correct in its meaning according to the mukashafun, which is, I was a hidden treasure. Right, and I longed to be known, and so I created the creation, and by me, they have known me. Right. كنت كنزا مخفيا فأحببت أن أعرف فخلقت الخلق فبي عرفوني. Right. So this is this symbolizes the emergence of al-ta'ayyun al-awwal, right? Which is God. This is al-mahabba al-dhatiyya. It's Allah Ta'ala's loving to be known. There's no one else with him who's going to know him apart from himself. Now he's obviously ghani an al-alamin. So we have to be very clear. If your aqidah is clear, then one doesn't worry about these. He's ghani an al-alam. He doesn't need to create the creation. So we get rid of that idea. But he wishes to create the creation, and so the bridge, as it were, between that pure itlaq, right, and the emergence of the world of creation is the al-haqiqah al-Muhammadiyah, right? Now the haqiqah, but now to be very clear, the haqiqah Muhammadiyah is just an object of knowledge. It's actually one of the ayan thabita, just like everything else. But it has a metaphysical priority, not a temporal priority, of course, because we're not talking. This is, a degree of reality beyond time. This is God's knowledge, eternal knowledge of Himself and of the world. It has a degree of priority to the other ayan thabita. The ayan thabita, for the benefit of your viewers, are the source forms, as it were. You might say the exemplars, the archetypes. It's a problematic term, but it's not. Others dismiss that term completely. It's not completely wrong, but they are the source forms, as it were, for the emergence of the world when it's created. So everything in creation possesses this source form in the divine knowledge, right? It's not the same as the created thing. Now, forgive my crudity, but it's, as it were, what Allah Ta'ala says kun to, right? Right, in order for the created thing to emerge. So the Haqiqah Muhammadiyah is the ta'ayyun al-awwal. It's the first determination. It encapsulates the whole of creation in this ijmali way, in this general way, right? And it's for that reason that the Mukashafun, the people in the school of Shaykh Al-Akbar and other Sufi schools, they say that the Ayan Thabita all of the other Ayan are furu', right? Are a far', they're branches of the Haqiqah Muhammadiyah, right? What does that mean? It means that somehow the whole is related to microcosm, macrocosm. Somehow all the sun and the moon and the angels and the stars and the universe is somehow a far' of human nature, and it all exists for the sake of human nature, right? And this ultimate archetype of human nature is al-Haqiqah al-Muhammadiyah. This is the perfect madhar of Allah Ta'ala in his Jamal and his Jalal in a perfect balance. Now, a madhar is a locus of manifestation. It's not the same as the thing of which it is a madhar. So there's no sense of pantheism or any sense of some sort of confusing identity of Allah Ta'ala with his creation. I mean, I always find that very extraordinary because it's so explicitly disavowed in all of the works of Akbarianism that I've ever read. Yeah, but madhar is a way in which a divine reality becomes manifest. What does it mean? It means to become zahir, so that creation can see it, so that it becomes manifest, literally. So anyway, so you have the ahadiyah, you have the wahda, you have the wahidiyah, which is the level of the dhuhur of the asma, right? All of the divine attributes and names, they become manifest distinctly, right, on the level of the ayana thabita, through the ayana thabita, right? God has them in himself, but the point is, on the level of ahadiyah, there's no name or description. It's total negative theology. So yes, he has all of the divine names, but they're not distinct in a way which is knowable to us on that level. They become knowable to us on the level of the Ayana Thabita, which, by the way, in the Akbarian understanding is the highest level of mystical knowledge that one can possibly have, because one can't even know God in his itlaq. Right. So, but this is all the level of the divine knowledge, and it's uncreated. It's uncreated because God doesn't create his own knowledge. He already knows it, right? He can't say, I'm going to decide, hashalillah, Mithaal, that I'm going to, I'm going to create my knowledge of the world now. He's God. He already knows every conceivable possible object of knowledge eternally in and of his own essence. In fact, they say that his knowledge of the world is a consequence of his knowledge of his own essence, but we don't need to get into that. But then the first level of creation is alam al-arwah, is the world of spirits. It's the first world of creation. And what is distinctive about it? Now, Imam al-Sha'rani has a very interesting question that he raises in al-Yawaqit wal-Jawahir. He says, it's an interesting puzzle, which has a brilliant answer to, which is, well, if everything already exists in the divine knowledge eternally, what is the point of creating it? It's already there. Also, what does anything gain by being created if it's already there? Well, what it gains, he then goes on to answer, and he cites the Futuhat in this, is it gains self-knowledge. So the Ayat Thabita, again, to get rid of the shubha that somehow there's multiplicity in the divine essence in the divine realm, because we're talking about ahadiyah and wahda and wahidiyah. None of the Ayan Thabita have self-consciousness insofar as the Ayan Thabita, right? Allah knows them, but they don't know themselves. Being created means, in this understanding, means to be granted self-consciousness, as it were, to wake up and to start representing the world from a perspective. That's what happens in Alam al-Arwah. So Alam al-Arwah is the level of spirits, of the angels, of lofty spiritual beings, which have a tremendous level of closeness to Allah Ta'ala.
So that's their spiritual element.
Right.
Separated,
Exactly.
not yet placed into their physical bodies.
Exactly.
And this spiritual element is not an abstract. It is their actual spirits.
Exactly. It's a realm, it's an actual world of spirits in which these beings dwell. And we say in which, I mean, we shouldn't think of it as temporal and spatial in the same way as our world. But then you have the world subordinate to that, which is Alam al-Mithaal. So the Ayan Thabita are mazahir, they are loci of manifestation of the divine names. The world of spirits, that the beings in the world of spirits, are mazahir, they are loci of manifestation of the Ayan Thabita. Then there's a further level of manifestation, a further world. What do we mean by a world? It means it's literally a world. It has different individuation conditions. So, for example, the world that we're in right now is very familiar to us, obviously, because it's a world of corporeality, time and space. Being bound by time and space. We can't be in two places at once. We're here speaking to each other. We can't, as far as I know, be in two places at once, and so on. So it has particular individuation conditions. If something exists in this world, it's going to exist in a particular form. The other worlds are the places where beings exist and have life, but they have different individuation conditions, right? So the Alam al-Arwah, for example, is not temporally bound in the same way that this world is. This world is for al-mutaghayyirat al-tadrijiyah. This world is for beings which are changing and they're growing and they're turning. They're not only, let's say, growing up from being a child to an adult, they're also increasing in knowledge and they're going through different states. We're mutaghayyirat tadrijiyah, so we're changing beings which change in levels and degrees and incrementally. Whereas the beings in al-Arwah don't change. They're not. They don't
age.
Sorry?
They don't age.
Exactly. They don't age. They don't need to go and acquire knowledge incrementally. They already possess their full perfection, as it
Nor
were.
sustenance do they need.
Exactly. Precisely. Not in the same way, except in terms of the sustenance, in terms of deriving their existence from Allah Ta'ala. So they're different. Well, Allahu Alam, they're different individuation conditions. Then Alam al-Mithaal is an intermediary world. It's an isthmus. It's what's called a barzakh between Alam al-Arwah and Alam al-Mulk, the sensory world that we're in.
This world.
Which is this world. And that is a world, it's a very extraordinary place because this is the world of, well, you could translate it as the world of imaginal representations. But what it is a world where pure meanings take multiple bodily forms. Pure meanings take multiple bodily forms. Now, it's a kind of latif body. It's not kathif in the same way as this world, but it's a world where pure meanings take multiple bodily forms. Exactly. So give some examples. How did Sayyidina Jibreel take lots of different forms? For example, in the hadith, the very, very basic and fundamental hadith where he comes to teach the Prophet ﷺ about Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, he comes in the form of one of the Sahaba, Sayyidina Dihya. And now, so this raises an immediate question. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ leaves the cave after the initial revelations, he sees Sayyidina Jibreel also, but he sees him in a different form, taking up the entire horizon. Now the question then becomes, and then in the Mi'raj, he sees him in yet different forms. And there's a certain point in which he sees him in his true form. Now, all the time we're saying Jibril, 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 but he's taking a different form in each time. Now, if a human being was to keep on taking different forms, he wouldn't keep on thinking that it was the same human being. The human being is simply I'm Hasan, I have this particular physical appearance. If I suddenly appear in the form of Richard Dawkins and say I'm Hasan Spiker, then no one's going to believe me. But the point is, in Alam al-Mithaal, the same reality, the same essence, the same being takes multiple corporeal forms, but it's the same being, right? So Alam al-Mithaal is a way of understanding. It's an object of experience. It's a world of experience to the Mukashafun. But I'm saying it also has a utility in actually making a lot of sense of a lot of the data of revelation, of scriptural accounts that we have, scriptural knowledge that we're given. When, for example, the a'mal tatajassad in the next life, in the barzakh, right? How can a'mal take bodily forms? What does that even mean? The a'mal. So what does it mean to say that is that bodily form? That physical form is Jibreel, and that other physical form is Jibreel as well. How can you say that? It's all understood in terms of al-Mithaal. When the Prophet ﷺ was offered either wine or milk, or in another riwayah, water or milk, al-kama qal, I think that's it. Then and it was said he chose the milk, and it was said you've chosen the fitrah. What does that mean? How is milk the fitrah? Like really, like literally, milk is milk. It's not the fitrah. So al-Mithaal explains the possibility. How is symbolism possible? How is symbolism possible? When we look at a tree, for example, but it has all of this symbolic resonance. In the Akbarian understanding, that would be because, well, actually there is a realm that physical appearance of a tree is actually just one image of a meaning, right? Which in al-Mithaal takes lots of different images, right? So and for example, eschatological report, a ram being brought and slaughtered, and it is said death has been killed. Again, how is that death? It's a ram.
Yeah.
Again, that's understood in terms of al-Mithaal. So that's seen as being,
So the Alam al-Mithaal is the essential home base, or the true location of treeness, deathness as a concept. Riba is not something that we see, right? It's like a transaction, but it's not a thing that we can hold and touch. A contract with riba in it is paper and ink. So that's an idea too. Yet we are told in the Day of Judgment it's a river of blood. So you're saying essentially that Alam al-Mithaal, it seeks to explain this. And so my follow-up question, and it's a kathif question. In other words, a question from someone trying to imagine what is somebody who's never heard of this thinking. And that question is, so are you saying that it is a kind of location where treeness has a true form from which all these trees are branches? Is that what you're saying?
It's more the idea that the physical appearance of a tree in this world. Now, in this world, we don't have to think about al-Mithaal. It's just a tree. I mean, you chop it down, and as Marx said, to a capitalist, it's lumber. To a poet, it's this. It's to a mystic, a manifestation. To a poet, it's actually just a tree, and so on. But the point is, a tree is, for all intents and purposes in this world, it's just a tree. I mean, it doesn't. It doesn't. You might sit under it. You might chop it down. Whatever. But the point is, if you look at it in its more fundamental, its ontological derivation, because our whole idea is that this world is not self-standing, self-sufficient. Now, of course, we all believe, all of the different schools believe it was created by God. The Akbarians are no different in that. And I say that Akbarians, I mean, Imam al-Ghazali and Mishkat al-Anwar is very, very close to this, by the way. But it's there's more of a detailing, right? It's not really a fundamental difference as much as there's more of a detailing, which is all we're saying is there's this world and there's also lots of other worlds that God's created.
Yeah.
And they're all connected to each other. Right. And they actually, there's a relationship of subordinacy one to another, all the way, I hate to say up to the divine. I don't mean in any sense like that, obviously, but, all the way, in a ma'nawi sense, all the way up to closeness to the divine reality. Okay. So just to get to your question specifically, the ultimate intelligibility of a tree is going to go right up to the alam al-arwah and the ayan al-thabita. The level that the alam al-mithal is particularly explaining is the level of a ma'nawi dimension. Let's say, just for the purposes of discussion, right? Let's say, a tree has these qualities of the sense of being a pillar, of thabat, of giving, it gives out oxygen, of being a symbol of life, for example, right? So I'm not doing ta'een of what is a tree in Alam al-Mithal, but the point is a tree is a symbolic representation in this world of something that in Alam al-Mithal is broader and could potentially take other bodily forms other than a tree, which might have the same meaning. That's the idea.
So it's very close to what Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu said. He said that every description in Jannah of a fruit, it has that and the name, but it has many, many other things. So, or I think he's actually said all it shares is the name. So that the pomegranate in this life, like it has a shell, it has a lot of work to do and it can stain you, and it has a lot of negatives to the pomegranate, right? Such that the paradisical pomegranate shares nothing with this pomegranate except its name.
That's incredible. MashaAllah. Yeah. هذا الذي رزقنا من قبل, وأتوبه متشابهة.
Mutashabiha. So something links it to make you recognize it. Maybe the redness, maybe part of the flavor, but it's a whole nother thing. But Allah calls this a pomegranate and he calls that a pomegranate. So you're saying Alam al-Mithal is a way to understand how one meaning can take on these different forms.
Yeah, exactly.
And it is not meant is not meant to indicate the existence of some physical place where there's the ultimate pomegranate.
No.
Okay. Good. So we have a question from this young.
Because that's a common misconception about this type of thinking.
Yeah.
That which is the reduplicative misinterpretation that somehow you've just got a table here and then up there there's a even better table.
Yeah. So Alam al-Mithal is fair to say that it is an abstract construct to help us understand how things have different forms.
Well, it has a conceptual efficacy. It has a conceptual practical purpose. But the Mukashafun would say, no, this is an existing place. Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from Ammar. Go ahead. What's your question?
This idea, I think it kind of delves into the idea of whether how existence and essence kind of interact. Because the modern notion, the liberal notion, is that the liberal notion is that essence comes after existence, meaning that things exist and then we define what they are. That's smart. Things are defined as after existence.
After the physical aspect.
Yeah. And so what this idea kind of indicates towards is
the opposite.
The opposite of that is that for example, masculinity and femininity exist in Alam al-Amthal, and then we have multiple different. I think you wrote about this, Shaykhna. And if you could touch about how this idea kind of can be used to push back against like philosophical liberalism.
Okay, so if anyone didn't hear, if the mic wasn't clear to anyone, Ahmad brings up a great point. He says that the materialists see an object like a stick and believe that the material matter is the core and all the other things about its essence come after that. But he's saying that it would seem to be that Ibn Arabi is saying that no, it's the total opposite. The essence and meaning exists first, and this is merely one form of it. And so in that sense, this concept is a refutation of materialism.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very good way of explaining it. I mean, obviously there are lots of different ways of looking at this, but I mean, take Sartre, for example, who's, not fashionable now, but that just shows you how kind of fickle modernity is. But, for most of let's say the second and third quarters of the 20th century, he was the most popular and famous philosopher in the world with a kind of real popular appeal, a public intellectual. And his whole doctrine was that existence is prior to essence. But what did he mean by that? He meant that there aren't any essences. Essences are all constructed. We're the ones creating them. All that we are before we construct essences are these pure existences. I mean, it's this kind of pure blind, inchoate energy, as it were, which has
physicalities.
Yeah, pure physicality, just will. I mean, his main focus is just the fact that we all have access to our own will, but it's completely arbitrary, right? And we can direct it this way or that. And then we construct these realities, and then we mistake them for real realities. So, because lots of human beings and societies have got together and decided that there's something called human nature, we imagine that it's actually this concrete thing out there. Not actually. And to become truly free is to become mature and free, is to realize those aren't really out there, and that you can create your own human nature. Like every individual can create their own human nature in whatever way that they want. They can define it themselves. It's completely up to them, their own construction. So in a way, it's a refutation of something like that, and refutation of all forms of materialism, which is not in any case. If you think of modern physicalism, where the whole idea is that everything is physical, whatever that's supposed to mean, and then consciousness itself is what they call an epiphenomenon. It's an emergent property. I mean, that's a completely ridiculous and incoherent view anyway. We shouldn't give it any credence or take it seriously, frankly, because what they're saying is the means by which, as in consciousness, which is the means by which this purely physical being then turns around and says, this is just a physical being. There's nothing spiritual about it. There's nothing metaphysical about it. That means is actually just a series of physical processes going off, neurons firing, essentially. And yet we're supposed to trust what it is purporting to objectively tell us about reality and the nature of reality. It's absurd, it's ridiculous. So
it undermines its own engine that produced it.
Precisely.
Sartre is actually, this concept is actually pure kufr. And
he's a kufri as it gets.
The pagan is actually, in his paradigm, is actually closer, because the pagan does say there is an absolute, but he's got the wrong absolute. He points to an idol or something like that. Whereas this kind of kufr makes kufr of everything, right? Which then actually should really disqualify him from making any conclusions about anything, right? So that's the inconsistencies, that they're claiming to make a conclusion while actually making kufr of the source that produced that conclusion.
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing. Our ability to know the world and say, I'm giving you a true account of what the world is, even if it's the materialist. That ability, that pure intelligibility, the knowability of the world is the ultimate refutation of atheism and kufr. because that intelligibility itself is such a miracle.
Yeah.
It makes absolutely no sense. Directly refutes the idea that reality is somehow fundamentally material.
Yeah.
If it was fundamentally material, it wouldn't be possible to have a true intelligible, as in, mental object of the mind, intelligible account of what it is. That simply
Correct.
wouldn't be possible.
Correct. Now, let's move to another subject. Wahdat al-Shuhud and Wahdat al-Wujud. Are they merely semantic differences, or are they the same thing, or are they separate things? Different concepts. For everyone for listening, Wahdat al-Wujud is Ibn Arabi's concept. The literal translation is oneness of being. Wahdat al-Shuhud, I believe that came from Al-Imam al-Rabbani, who described it as oneness of witnessing, and he meant by that, whenever you witness anything, you recognize it to be a manifestation of the divine will. So are they the same thing, or are they different?
Well, Imam Rabbani is obviously a great Imam, radiallahu anhu, someone that we all have huge respect for, and his maktubat are extraordinarily beneficial and full of amazing daqa'iq. But his understanding of Wahdat al-Shuhud is that it is a further level of experience that Ibn Arabi didn't get to. Had he got to that level of experience, he would have realized that actually what he thought was the unity of existence was just the appearance of the unity of existence. It's not that reality is actually a manifestation of Allah Ta'ala. Now, the thing is, from the perspective of someone who is faithful to Ibn Arabi's school of thought, and of course we're faithful to the Prophet ﷺ and Allah Ta'ala, it's not in that sense, but finds themselves subscribing to that school of thought based on evidence and nazar and their own conviction. This is based on a kind of misunderstanding. As shocking as that might seem, but the truth is, the aqwal of the Arifin can be contradictory. They're not ma'asum. If the aqwal are contradictory, it means that one of them's right and one of them's wrong, actually. There's no real way to escape that. Obviously, when it comes to madhahib and things, one might take Imam Sha'rani's line and others and say all of the madhahib are true and they're all correct. And so, but it's not, when it comes to haqa'iq and aqliyat, that doesn't work. So there's only one truth of the matter here. Now, there's a tendency today. So, I mean, before I get to there, to just say it starkly and frankly, the Akbarians would say that Imam Sirhindi was wrong about that, because Shaykh al-Akbar is not saying that reality is to be identified with Allah Ta'ala. That's not what Wahdatul Wujud means. Without necessarily getting into the particular details, in fact, I discussed this very question in a recent podcast I did with my friend Shaykh Anwar Mangal, which was it's called The Two Mullahs, and it was episode 3. If anyone wants to go back to that, we discussed that in quite a lot of detail. But to get to the particular point that you're raising, the interesting thing about today, where there's a kind of what could be described as a kind of reaction, I don't want to say reactionary, but in some sense a reactive attitude from a lot of people who, let's say, mostly those who become religious in this kind of self-conscious way, that somehow we always have to err on the side of caution, and Ibn Arabi is a great wali, but we have to be a bit careful of him because his doctrines can be confusing, and they can be. Now, there's a certain type of truth to that, but all I'd say is, contrary to what people tend to assume, which is that Imam Sirhindi came along, respected Ibn Arabi, but actually corrected him on many issues where he seemed to diverge from the agreement with exoteric scholarship and conclusions, there's a tendency to assume that Imam Sir Hindi must have been right, and the really orthodox, careful thing to do is to agree with Imam Sir Hindi. Now, the reality is, most of the people in Imam Sir Hindi's own line agreed with Ibn Arabi on this point, not with Imam Sir Hindi. So Imam Sir Hindi's point is, Wahdatul Shuhud is a higher level of experience where beyond seeing Wahdatul Wujud, the Arif is shown that actually this is just in the Shuhud, it's in the witnessing. There's actually a distinction between Allah Ta'ala in himself and his manifestations. The Akbari would say it's based on a misunderstanding in the first place, because Shaykh al-Akbar is not saying that Allah Ta'ala in his manifestations is somehow, that those manifestations are identical to his essence in any way.
That would be pantheism.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So what is the explanation of Wahdatul Wujud?
Wow, what a question. Well,
that should be an episode in itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, the most basic understanding is simply only Allah Ta'ala has true existence. We call, colloquially, as it were, all of these different things around us, including ourselves, existences. So in that sense, we can say that we exist, but we don't exist in and of ourselves. We're not self-existent, and our existence in every way is derived. So the doctrine of Wahdatul Wujud is to say that there is only one true existence, which is Allah Ta'ala. Everything else is merely determinate. Yes, we can use the word existence for these, for the world, but it's not true existence. That's only one. This world is an image of the divine names, or it's a series of images. It's a world of images of the divine names, and this is based on this fine support from a hadith like, خلق الله آدم على سورة الرحمن, for example, that somehow the particular form that creation takes is an image of the divine nature. That in no way means that there's any form of identity. God is completely transcendent in himself, but it is an image, a manifestation, a madhar. And what Wahdatul Wujud explains is the utter dependency, whereas philosophical and kalam schools would typically they would limit our dependency in terms of philosophical explication simply to the fact that we've been granted existence, right? Now, we talk about, the Akbarian school talks about the ontological contingency, but it also talks about the formal contingency. It's also the fact that all of our attributes are derived from, as images, ultimately from the divine nature as an image. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. One can't emphasize the tanzih too much. They are nonetheless an image, and we have proof texts for that, like the sacred hadith خلق الله آدم على سورة الرحمن, which indicate that it is justified and religiously, in terms of source text, justified to speak in these terms, apart from aqli proofs, kashfi proofs, and so on. So it's not just that we're ontologically derived, it's also the question of, look at this world where we have all of these attributes. Where did they come from? We see manifestations of wisdom, we see manifestations of beauty, we see manifestations of identity, and so on. The Dawud al-Qaysari, radiallahu anhu, for example, says identity in this world, the al-huwiyya, the fact that I as Hasan Spiker manifest a particular identity, you as Sheikh Shadee Elmasry manifest a particular identity, he would say that identity as it appears in this world is a ray, without tashbih, of course, is a ray of his identity, right? It's a ray, it's an image. Again, I can't emphasize too much. There's no identity there, and there's no tashbih there, and there's no likening in the sense of there's any parity or equivalence. But the point is, where do these when we see beauty in this world, it's a ray of his beauty. When we see identity, it's a ray of his identity. When we see wisdom in this world, it's a ray of his identity. In that sense, we are constantly in Allah Ta'ala's qabda, not only in terms of our existence, but also in terms of the actual shape and form that this world takes. It's also completely all derived from Allah Ta'ala. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله يمسك السماوات والأرض أن تزولا. Right? If we would immediately disappear if Allah Ta'ala wasn't constantly holding us in existence, not only in terms of the fact that we exist, but also the particular form that we take is also derived from his divine names. But all it's saying is that the only true existence is for Allah Ta'ala.
Okay, so that would only apply to that which we can connect to a divine attribute. What if the skeptic now says, what about bad things in the world? The sound of the donkey, or many things that we would want to clean off of our bodies, or something like that, or those dirty things, or the fact that nothing in this world is perfect. The atheist would always say. So no orb is perfect. The earth is not perfectly round. There's imperfections. So how are those treated or understood?
That's a very, very good question, which, as you know, is raised often in the literature, including the Akbarian. Now, as I answer, I'm just going to, give me 10 seconds, please, because I've just seen low battery. I'm going to need to plug in.
Sure, no problem.
I'm just going to move over my computer. I'll just give me 10 seconds.
Sure, no problem. No problem. Brothers and sisters, all those listening, we are with our guest, Shaykh Hasan Spiker. This is the Safina Society Nothing But Facts live stream. You could like the channel, subscribe to it so that you can get notifications. Turn your notification bell on, and you could support us at, Patreon.com. Patreon.com/Safina Society. You could be a supporter there, and you can keep in touch with us also on Instagram, Safina Society's channel there, Twitter, and now I'm going to give Blue Sky a chance. Jack Dorsey's competitor with Twitter. Give that a chance. You'll see us now there. And on every platform that our team puts our stuff on, these streams are supposed to be on Spotify, aren't they? Yeah. So they should be updated and linked up on Spotify. All right. Shaykh Hasan is back. He's saying if you could just move your camera down a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
To remove some of that space in the top there. Okay, to pick up where we left off. We left off on the fact that when we look at wonderful things of this world, we're seeing that they're manifestations of the divine attribute that is perfect in that respect. So when we see wisdom, we know that that is a manifestation of divine wisdom. When we see beauty, manifestation of divine beauty. And this is the common, also really it's not just a mystical perspective, it's the common man's theology, right? This is how we know that there is order and there is one a controlling creator who is filled with beauty and wisdom. When you go out and look at nature, that's the natural reaction people get. Now, the atheists and the skeptics, they like to answer back and say, okay, well, what about the crocodile that just ate that beautiful deer? What about the sickness in the world? What about all the bad things? What about all the imperfections of this world? So now I ask about Wahdatul Wujud and the Akbarian thought regarding that. What are they manifestations of or not manifestations of?
Well, it's important to recognize that Allah Ta'ala, as they say, limitlessly transcends the sights of manifestation. So he is not the sights of manifestation. He's not the mother.
He's not the thing that we're talking.
Exactly. He's not the things that become manifest. One could say, I mean, stretching language a bit, that they are symbols of Allah Ta'ala's names and attributes. They're not identical to them.
Correct.
But they have no reality outside of, as it were, and lillahul mathal a'la, I don't mean literally, but outside of the shadow cast by those metaphysical realities. They have no reality, or one might even say they are the shadow cast by them. And I'm thinking of a Quranic verse they often cite in that regard, but it's escaping me. In any case, so he limitlessly cites the transcends the sights of manifestation. So, in the first place, the idea that, well, you're saying that these things become manifest as qadurat and so on. For one thing, there's no identity there. Yeah. We're not saying that they are in any way the divine. Second of all, our account of evil is definitively as a privation. So evil or imperfection or deficiency is the absence of perfection. It's the absence of the full good. In the Akbarian understanding, Allah Ta'ala is al-Khair al-Mahd. He is the pure good. And existence itself, which is Allah Ta'ala itself, existence itself, not the existences, existence itself, the only true being, is pure goodness. Any dissent from that pure goodness is a deficiency in that pure good. It's a deficiency. It's a reduction in that pure goodness. It's an impairment of that full goodness insofar as it's entering multiplicity. It's becoming limited. It's becoming needy of other things around it. It's not the pure good, certainly of Allah Ta'ala himself, but even of let's say the angelic realm. As things descend, the imperfections accumulate.
Is it are those bad things the absence of good, or are they creations in themselves? So is evil, are bad things independent creations, or are they the absence of perfection?
Well, one has to think in answering that question of how it is that we affix the characterization to those things of bad, of evil.
Correct.
Right. So what that gets into is the question of whether al-husn al-qubh are shad'i or not, whether they are, we only find out about whether something is good and evil because we are told in the revelation, or if we have some means of knowing outside of the revelation, or if there is, let's say, they work together, the various sources, to let us know about good and evil, or if, let's say, there are certain things which we only know about from the Shara, and this is actually Ibn Arabi's position. It's also a Maturidi position. It's certain the opinion of certain Ash'aris that when we say that al-husn al-qubh are both Shad'i, right, we mean in terms of, people often misunderstand that as meaning that we can have no knowledge left to our own devices. Let's say in the absence of revelation, if we hypothesize that, we would have no knowledge whatsoever of good and evil. If we were to see an old lady crossing the road, we'd have no idea whether that was good or evil, and it would be fine to run them over because we have simply no idea. We hadn't been informed by the Shara, right? Now that's there's a misunderstanding, I would say, of the Ash'ari position. I would say any Ash'ari position, really, because what al-husn al-qubh being Shad'i means is that this is answering the question of tarattub al-thawab wal-iqab, right? We only find out about the fact that such actions lead to punishment in the next life or reward in the next life. Whatever action leads either to punishment, if it's a good action, it's a reward in the next life, through the Shara. The Shara is what informs us of that. But that doesn't mean we can't know with our aql whether something is good or evil. It's just that we don't know the fullness of the ultimate implications of that action.
The otherworldly.
That's otherworldly. The otherworldly implications. Exactly.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Now there are other things. As I said, there is that kind of the way that the aql and the shara work together. The aql provides, as it were, the foundations of that knowledge, and then the shara provides the fullness of the knowledge. One of the Maturidi arguments against the, let's say, the straw man Ash'ari account is, well, you have to know some things are good, otherwise you wouldn't even bother to believe in the revelation in the first place.
You wouldn't know. You wouldn't have a link to tell you that this prophet is true and
exactly.
good. Yeah.
Exactly. Precisely. And so so that's one of the Maturidi critiques. Now, as I said, Ibn Arabi's own position is very much compatible with these different schools. I don't even like to talk about different schools. You know, my own kind of training with my own sheikh, he never spoke about different schools. He wasn't, in that sense, sectarian at all. He always saw Ibn Arabi's view and the Ash'ari view and the Maturidi view as basically the same view, with little nuances here or there. They're not kind of these discrete, totally separate points of view and then when you're making a Twitter account, you say, I'm so and so al Ash'ari or al Akbari or al Mat. It's become this identitarian thing. They very much flow into one another. They're compatible with each other. They recognize one another, and one scholar may well take different positions from different schools. It's not like it's a Wahdatul wahida. If I'm an Ash'ari, then to make sure that it's all Ash'ari compliant. That's at least not the way that I was taught. But in any case, his view is that there are some things. Let's say, the fact that Maghrib is 3 rak'ahs. The aql doesn't really have there's no way that the aql can infer that is going to, lead to reward in the akhirah, or that is in itself Hasan or anything.
Only by transmission, revelation.
It's only by revelation.
Yeah. And I like what you said about even just the judgment of something being good and bad itself. It has examination. So, for example, if somebody says, well, all this beauty, and then we just see defecation next. Oh, you're looking at a beautiful lake. Yeah. You see defecation next to the lake. It's so ugly. It ruined it. Actually, even something as universally vile as defecation, even by Sharia, it's not just immediately you have to dispose of it. That's the obligation in the Sharia of human waste. But if we can ponder human waste a little bit, we willfully put stuff in our mouths. No one produces human waste on its own. You produce human waste after you make the decision to put something in your mouth and eat it. You decided that. Then Allah Ta'ala takes all of this, takes all the good stuff, you use it, all the bad stuff, puts it into this thing that can sit in your body for a while and then come out with ease, right? And
to remove the
other. And then for you to know that it's not something anyone should consume. Okay, then he made it smell bad and look ugly and everything like that as a signifier, like putting a skull and a crossbone on poison, right? Whereas milk, on the other hand, also comes out of the cow, but that is good. It smells good. It only comes out at your own willpower. It doesn't just come out on accident, so then it will be wasted. So even the signifying something as good or bad, right, is oftentimes a matter of perspectives. Yeah, it's bad to step into it, but its existence is it is a rahmah for human beings, right? There's a perspective that even every bad thing that we call bad is also a rahmah. Iblis is a rahmah because as one of the shuyukh said, no mu'min can attain ranks without the antagonism of Iblis against him.
Exactly.
The resistance of fighting him. So really from every perspective, you can find a good ending in something that we consider really bad. We've kept you for a long time, but there are some questions. I did promise some people that we would answer some questions. So we could do, if you would like, a rapid fire set of questions on Shaykh al-Akbar ibn Arabi. And the first question is regarding the transmissions of Ibn Arabi. Are they accurate? And what would we say about some views that were transmitted about him or from him that would seem to be non-Sunni views, such as Fir'aun accepted Islam. Okay. What do we say about that? These are some far'i rapid fire questions now.
Yeah, there are different views on that. There are views that there's a lot of dust in Ibn Arabi's work, specifically the Fusus al-Hikam. There are interpolations that other people put in. But I don't agree with that view. I don't think that there's dust in Fusus al-Hikam. And I think the best evidence for that is the fact that his immediate commentators and his immediate line, which are people like Shaykh Sadr al-Qurawi, Ma'ayyad al-Din al-Jandi, al-Qashani, Dawud al-Qaysari, and so on, they commentate on the Fusus with all of those putative, alleged interpolations. So they don't say they're interpolations. So, I mean, that for me is a pretty much a Burhan Qat'i. So, the alternative to that is to say, well, either he's a wahashahu, far be it from his a raging heretic, or we need to interpret those statements differently so that they are compatible with Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. That's what his commentators typically do. They interpret those statements. Also, when one has a nuanced understanding of usul and so on, one becomes, more critically aware of what masail actually constitute heterodox conclusions. I don't particularly want to enter into every one of those problematic issues here, but it's not necessarily, if one takes a line which is against the dominant view, but it's based on evidence and reasoning, yasih arabiyatan, right? It's based on a sound interpretation of the actual Arabic expression, and there's sound evidence for within the text itself for that interpretation, even if it's a very unfamiliar interpretation. It's not possible to say that that person is somehow immediately a heretic, because they're simply telling you what they're convinced of. They have all of the alat, they have all of the necessary apparatuses that they need, the tools that they need to interpret the text. And we know that Shaykh al-Akbar absolutely did. And he's interpreted it differently. He said, no, the broad, I can see that the mainstream interpretation of this verse is wrong. The point is, it's not there are some interpretations which are just wrong. Let's say if you're going against a nas, for example, if there's a nas and there's no possible way to this word or sentence or verse doesn't in any way admit in itself of a legitimate other interpretation, even if it's weak, then that interpretation is simply batil, right? So I don't think that those parts of the Fusus are interpolations.
Okay.
Now, another thing I'd say, however, is I'm not a muqallid of Shaykh al-Akbar. As far as I'm concerned, sometimes he's giving his interpretation of scripture. More often than not, possibly all the time, I'd be allowed to say I know, but more often than not, I believe, supported by his direct experience, his kashf, right? But on issues, for example, of, let's say, what they call the cooling of the fire, right? I don't believe it.
Yeah. What is that question on that?
Yeah, I don't believe in the cooling of the fire.
Do not believe or do believe?
No, I don't. I'm not a muqallid of Shaykh al-Akbar.
Yeah.
I haven't had that experience. As far as I'm concerned, Shaykh al-Akbar is telling us about his experience. And then he also says, well, there's actually a legitimate way, and he knows there's a legitimate way to make this fit with the source texts, right? This is what he typically does.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't had that experience, and I'm no one's, he's telling me about his experiences. I have a strong husn al-dhan for him. I believe that he's telling us something very, very significant when he tells us these things. I think very often the way that necessarily becomes expressed in language can really ruffles people's feathers, and that's sometimes because of the gulf between experience and our ability to express it. But Ibn Arabi is believed by the consensus of the Arifun to be a wali, to be someone who has the highest level of spiritual experience. Look, he can be wrong. He's not a Masoom prophet. He can be wrong about certain things. But as long as it's based on a legitimate shubha, it's not possible to hurl someone into, to hurl accusations of disbelief or as long as it's in accordance in the broadest, fundamental minimum necessary of the canon